Hello and welcome to Become the Teapot. I'm Iain.
And so am I. And this is a podcast all about comic books and their film adaptations.
And this week we're getting spooky as we watch Ghost World. Ooh.
No, Iain. Ghost World is a 2001 dark comedy about two cynical pseudo-intellectual teenagers.
And it turns out one of them was dead all along. Ooh.
No. It's a slice-of-life look at teenage angst in suburban USA, based on a comic by Daniel Clowes.
And the town is haunted. Ooh.
I think I'm going to need some help with this.
So who you going to call?
James?
Yeah?
Do you want to help us talk about Ghost World?
Yeah, I love horror movies. Ooh.
Oh, for fuck's sake. James, welcome to the show. For those of you at home that don't know, James is not just an old friend of ours, but also the unofficial composer for Become the Teapot. In fact, both our intro music and Ian's Egg Hunt were orchestrated by him.
Orchestrated is the key word, because my talents are like the sum of an orchestra combined.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, as anyone who has listened to that intro music just then can attest. So, that's one thing you now know about James. We're going to get to know him a bit better with our tried and tested questions. This is to give you, our listeners, a better idea of where James is coming from in terms of comic books and their related media, to see what his perspective brings. So, James.
Yes.
Let's start with the obvious. What is your familiarity with comic books and comic book properties?
I'm going to try and lengthen this concept of comic book into something a bit more abstract.
Yeah, typical you, yeah.
Of course. You've got to really think about these things, you see. I'd say, historically, some of the first comic book or comic book type medium would have been something like the French Tintin comic adventures.
Yep.
So the more
Belgian.
More Belgian.
Blonde quiff and a fluffy dog, I'd say.
Yes.
Historically, yeah, it would have been things like Tintin, and then growing up it would have been like even the Pokemon comic books and comic strips like Calvin and Hobbes and things like that. I quite like a concise punchline surrounded by doodles.
Okay. Doodles.
Doodles.
I mean,
I think so. And then sort of as I grew up beyond teenage years, I would say things that caught my attention would have been like Alan Moore's series of books, specifically things like Watchmen. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of diverted down into slightly more dystopian or surrealist types of comics, such as Tank Girl, for example, with Jamie What's-His-Face that did Gorillas.
yeah.
Artists such as Doug TenNapel. I think he's probably best well known for his Earthworm Jim series, but he did a number of unusual comics about teenagers getting into kind of adventures through their imagination, which again brings me back to Calvin and Hobbes. I really liked bits of X-Men. I'd say that as far as superhero comics goes, I probably read some Spider-Man and mostly X-Men. Mm-hmm. But broadly, I'm not actually that familiar with a lot of the Marvel intellectual property, nor DC and things like that. So coming to the podcast, I'm actually quite unfamiliar with the Marvel types of things, and I really delve into much more of a unusual adventures in comic books. Two others that I really like are Transmetropolitan, which is about a kind of badass journalist called Spider Jerusalem and his travels in a dystopian future city. And finally, I like the works of Alejandro Jodorowsky, a filmmaker who then teamed up with Mobius, who's an artist, to produce quite a lot of interesting works, such as The Inkle, things like that.
Yeah. Jodorowsky has been in the news recently for the copy of Dune, Jodorowsky's Dune, that's been bought by the people who do NFTs and Bitcoin, who think it gives them the rights to make the film or an animated series of it when it's just a copy of a book. Yeah. It's very impressive lack of knowledge with regards to how copyright works. But
So in that case, I own a bunch of comics, so therefore I own the X-Men.
Yeah, that is the belief, yeah.
It's essentially that. It's interesting about that, actually. There's a documentary was released on Jodorowsky's Dune, and it was about the failure of them trying to to make it special. So he had changed the story of Dune. He had written it all himself, basically. It was very much based around the ships and about Paul. He had his son play the character of Paul, and he wasn't even an actor, so that was interesting.
Yeah.
And then he had famously storyboarded every single frame, and compiled this enormous book. And with it, he basically lost all funding, and it slowly broke down and failed. And then it was later picked up by David Lynch in one of the worst adaptations ever made.
In fairness, there's nothing to say that Jodorowsky's Dune. People are very excitable about it as a concept, but it would have been massively too long, tonally all over the place. And I think the best film we're going to get out of Jodorowsky's Dune is the film about the making of it and the failure of making it. The documentary is probably better than the film would have been.
No, I agree with that. An interesting thing about the documentary is it's heavily biased on Jodorowsky's side.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that we haven't seen anything come out of the making of this film. There's never been any film, so all we're going on is basically Jodorowsky's word that it's going to be a groundbreaking film. And so his adaptation supposedly brought to life Star Wars and other enormous franchises, and it's just assumed that his work theoretically would have been so groundbreaking that it had rippled through time to create these other film franchises.
It is a nuts documentary, in all honesty. I mean, it's crazy what they imply that film was going to be without any sort of evidence whatsoever. Yeah. But let's get back onto topic, shall we? Away from Jodorowsky's Dune and back to comic books and comic book films. So you've said there what your earliest days were like, but what was the last comic book you read that wasn't for this show?
I think prior to reading Ghost World, not the horror film that we so much were excited for, but actually an interesting teen coming of age story. I think prior to that, probably most recently would have been some web comics, actually. Something like Dinosaur Comics or XKCD or SMBC, Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. I'd say those are the things that I most recently would have looked at. But I think prior to that, as a series, I would have read Scott Pilgrim. I would have read... What's the follow-up he did? Seconds or something?
Seconds, and also Lost at Sea.
Yeah, I haven't read Lost at Sea, but I'm familiar with Brian Lee O'Malley. And Kick-Ass as well. I really like Kick-Ass. I really liked Scott Pilgrim, and I really like the slightly left field, hyper violent, unusual types. I wouldn't really consider Scott Pilgrim hyper violent.
No, that's video game logic, really, there, isn't it? Of violence.
I mean, he does chop people into gold coins, piles of them.
Yeah, he headbutts people to death.
That's true.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to say webcomics. It's one avenue. You know, I read a lot of comic books. It's one avenue I haven't really gone down is webcomics, and there's a few big ones that have been printed into physical comics. So there's some really good ones out there, I'm sure, and it gives a lot of creative freedom. They don't require publishers. It is just however long it takes you to do the work, you just put it up online.
Absolutely. I think that the internet and the idea of the bedroom composer or the bedroom artist has really come into play in all mediums, especially comic or web art. For example, one of the top Reddit posts of all time is by a comic artist called Sir Grapho, who does these really, really characteristic drawings of video game logic. And I think the top post of all time is something like an enormous buffed MMO character holding up a shield and absorbing all of these arrows. This newbie little level 1 player is next to him just like confused, and then the Titan character is like, press space to jump. That's it. And it's a really nice, sincere...
I think I've seen that, yeah.
I think that comic book medium as a whole has gone from being this enormous serial, massive undertaking. It's allowed in a lot of the bedroom artists to sort of have a piece of the action.
And I think that's where a lot of the major companies recruit from now as well, is that, you know, they find someone who's gained traction online and will hire those writers and artists to come and work for the larger companies as well now. Yeah, no, it's an interesting avenue. So if you have any recommendations for web comics that we could be reading.
Well, we did actually read one for the podcast. We read Spider-Man.
Brilliant.
Because he spits out words.
He does. You really don't know much about Marvel.
Arguably, Spider-Man would have been the first ever webcomic. 3 recommendations, I would say. I'd say Dinosaur Comics, which is absolute classic. A lot of the jokes really just sigh or nasal exhale. They're not that gripping. XKCD, if you're into your mathematics or physics, they often do science-based ones. XKCD actually did a really interesting comic which was just looking at all of the radiation that is naturally produced in different things and putting that into a graph. So it's not your normal comics, I wouldn't say. And then finally, SMBC, Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, and that's all about the husband and wife duo and some of their in-home antics. Always 3-4 panels, always a single punchline.
But you can read one a day or a couple a day and catch up with it that way. It's like that Calvin and Hobbes comic strip.
Yeah, I mean, arguably that's the vintage comic strip, isn't it? That's how they were originally made.
Yeah, the old newspaper comic strips. Yeah, definitely. The last couple of questions then for this section before we wrap up then, in terms of favourites, do you have a favourite comic book run or character? And do you have a favourite comic book movie or TV show?
Now, this is an interesting one. I'd probably say that my favourite comic book story is Scott Pilgrim, but I would say that my favourite comic book character is Tank Girl. Now, if you've seen the film adaptation of Tank Girl, it does her no justice whatsoever.
I have seen it, and I do not enjoy it.
No, the comic books themselves are great, and I really love Tank Girl as a character. It's very punk. It's very F the authority. So if you've ever seen Tank Girl, the movie, it's terrible. It does her no justice. However, the comic book character is very F the status quo. I've got an enormous rocket, and I'm going to blow up the bad guys. But in a kind of humorous way.
We did off air last week talk about Tank Girl because you were coming on, and I did look up the film, and it looks god awful. I've not watched it, but just by looking it up online, it looks terrible.
Yeah, but it's the artist of it. It's Jamie Hewlett, I think his name is, and he's the one that did the Gorillaz art with Damon Albarn and set up the whole Gorillaz character.
It's funny because obviously you said earlier about Spider Jerusalem as well, which is obviously another anti-authoritarian, very anti-establishment character. So yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme. And I know that you like Next Wave as well, which is also by Warren Ellis, so it's not a surprise. But yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme amongst favourites. Does it also carry over to your favourite movie or TV show?
I would say my favourite comic TV show would be X-Men the Animated Series.
Yeah.
Perfect. I would say that my favourite comic book film would be probably Scott Pilgrim, but that was written as an adaptation with Brian Lee O'Malley. I think he paid a lot of attention to his comics when writing it with Edgar Wright.
Well, it's funny you should say it because, as we discussed in our Scott Pilgrim episode, the comics were not complete when the film was written and made.
Yeah, that's it.
So he worked closely to the point where even some of the lines from the film went into the comics. So it was almost collaborative at times. I think potentially the lesbians line is one that translated from the film to the comics rather than vice versa.
Yeah, it was book 6, wasn't it? Book 6 was the one that had the ending, had the finale, and no one knew what it was going to be. And so simultaneously throughout the filmmaking and the comic book writing, all of the audience was kind of waiting in anticipation for this finale, and they didn't know what it was.
No, exactly. And that's why in the film you have a lot of the first 2 volumes, there's quite a lot of the comics in the film, whereas later volumes there's a lot less. You know, we raced through X's 4, 5 and 6 because they were still working on the comics at the time. Even though Brian Lee O'Malley had told them what was going to happen, they still didn't have the same framework as they did for the early part of the film.
An interesting thing about that actually is that the original locations that Brian Lee O'Malley used as reference for his comics, for example, the house opposite where his mum grew up and things like that, they were used on location for the films.
Yes.
The reason I say that Scott Pilgrim is probably my favourite comic book film is because of the amount of quality that Edgar Wright took from the writing and brought it into the film. Things such as Watchmen, I would say, is one of my favourite comic book films, but it differs so much from the comic that I would say that they are 2 different stories in a way.
2 questions for you. Very quickly. Would you say you preferred the Scott Pilgrim film or the Scott Pilgrim comic?
I would definitely say I prefer the comic.
Fair enough.
There's so much depth behind the scenes in the comics that don't come across in the film. For example, Scott Pilgrim making a fish finger sandwich for his cat that he's looking after, and how to cook a recipe, how to play a bass line, or how to do something. It's very much breaking the fourth wall in a way that greatly brings the reader into the universe of Scott Pilgrim that the film tries to do visually. You know, you'd have your Easter eggs in the background, you'd have your locations or your characters and things like that the film does, that would be wasted time if the film were to take these elements into it. But with a comic book with an almost infinite time period in which you can write or read a comic book at your own leisure. They take time to go down these avenues that are completely unrelated to the story, but really build or invest the reader into the universe.
And question 2, have you gone back to read Watchmen after watching the film?
I haven't, and that's only because when I used to live with a housemate that had the comic, I read it, but since then I haven't repurchased the comic, and I think it's only down to that. Down to me being a cheapskate.
Yeah. The reason that I bring that up is because I'd watched the film years ago and I'd not read the comic. And when we covered it on the podcast, we've changed the way that I view the film.
Yeah.
Because the comic's so in-depth, and the same thing it said about Scott Pilgrim, there's so much happening that you kind of take a step back from the film and go, well, actually, that film was terrible.
Yes, that's
Or
it.
just not a good comic book adaptation. They've just gone, right, page to screen, done. They've lost a lot of the history and the background and all of it.
Yeah, this is something we discussed on our episode, and something that I think Iain preferred the film to me, certainly, and to Chrissy, who was a guest for that episode. But yeah, we both found that although the film recreates things on an aesthetic level, it didn't really capture the depth of Watchmen, which I think is really where the strength of the comic lies.
In some sense, it's a fan service at a very, very shallow level.
Yeah. But that's Zack Snyder's MO. So, so you must be excited about the recent news that Netflix are making an animated adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comic books.
I had no idea that this is news to me as of this very second.
Well, there you go.
Please do tell me more.
Well, that's about all we know so far. That's been announced.
That's it.
I think they've announced the animation studio as well.
If I remember rightly, around the time that the film was being made, either prior to its release or in time with the release, there were animated scenes that were done in the animation style of Brian Lee O'Malley.
Yeah.
There were.
It was an Adult Swim cross-promotional cartoon, I think, that covered that early fight scene that he had in his school days.
Yeah. It was about punching a hole in the moon.
No, it was another one. It's when Lisa, who was cut out of the film entirely from the comics, and Scott in school when he goes and fights all the other rival school. Anyway, I feel we're getting off topic. Let's bring it back to the purpose of today's episode, the focus. Ghost World 2001 and Ghost World by Daniel Clowes. James, you're our guest, so we'll start with you. Yeah. Would you like to start with the film or the comic book?
Oh, that is a question. That is a question. Of all the questions to be asked in today's topic, you really stumped me.
I'm starting with a hard-hitting question like that.
I personally, now I don't know what you've prepared for, but I personally would like to start with the comic.
Okay then. Well, let's do that then. So, what are your thoughts about the comic? Did you enjoy it?
I bloody loved it. I thought it was amazing. I'm going to do a little bit of an intro for it, just to contextualise. So,
go for it.
Daniel Clowes is the author. I believe he was also the artist of it.
Yes.
He contributed art and stories to the Cracked magazine between 85 and 89, which is the year I was born. So it's relatively contemporary in that sense, or it was of a specific era of the 80s, which if you look at films of the 80s as well, you've got people like John Hughes, you've got the sort of coming-of-age teenage angst characters or the struggling through high school characters. I think that contextually, the time it was written is very telling. And Ghost World was actually written as part of something like 8 episodes of a larger comic that he wrote called 8 Ball. Mm-hmm. And they were later then serialized into one book. So the comic and the film are very different in that the comic takes place in small vignettes. However, the film takes place as one coherent story. So I think it's important to sort of contextualize that when doing comparative discussion on it. But also, like other comic book films which have been successful, Daniel Clowes actually was a co-writer for the film.
Yeah. I mean, he's one of the key writing credits on the film, along with the director, Terry Zwigoff. So, yeah.
I watched an interview with Daniel, and he says he thinks of this as being in the same world as in the film, being in the same world as Sunset Boulevard and a lot of earlier Stanley Kubrick films. So having the same sense of humour that doesn't quite read as being overtly funny, but it's still very natural and part of the characters. And as you said there as well, he was writing the film before he finished the comic. So he says that he didn't know how it was going to end. So they're 2 different stories, but very similar. So it's kind of going back to the Scott Pilgrim that we were talking about earlier on. It's got that same sort of... Yeah. He was writing the film without knowing how he was going to finish the comic off.
It's interesting that you brought up the ending of the stories. Some of the criticism of the film is that the ending is almost pointless. But I think that it's exactly the opposite when you read the comic, and that is that there is no definite end. There's no happily ever after ending. Of course, there's spoilers at the moment, so apologies to those listeners who have not read or seen it.
Oh, we don't care about them.
But it essentially ends the summer period, or like the period of time in which the conversations are happening with the characters, and the ending doesn't achieve anything really. It doesn't, there's no resolution, there's no happily ever after, and it's just a continuation of their lives as they develop.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think for me that's the film as well, though. It isn't setting out to wrap things up, because this is just a portion of people's lives, and it's a sort of realistic portrayal of teenage life at a period of time that isn't often covered in media. You talked earlier about a lot of films will cover the end of the school days or the beginning of university or college. They rarely cover that strange period in between where you're trying to figure out whatever comes next. And
it's the decision making, isn't it? It's
yeah,
the unknown and the conversations and the thought processes which undertake the decision making in how you're going to direct your life.
And sometimes it's not even about decision making. You're not actively deciding what to do next. You're just sort of aimlessly wandering and seeing where it takes you, and that is so much of what this comic and this film is that sort of aimless pottering around this unnamed suburban town, or city in the film, I think it is, just sort of waiting for something to happen. And obviously that's so much of in the film especially, but so much of a sort of crux of what happens in both is finding yourself without a direction, and deciding to take a step towards doing something about that, whatever that is.
This is why I find this such an important comic, is that it connects to you on a level that an action-adventure story doesn't. I don't have a damsel in distress that I need to save using my superpowers, so although I can find that entertaining, I don't connect to that on an emotional level. However, with something like Ghost World, it just takes me back to the teenage years. I don't know what I'm going to do at university. I don't even know which university to go to. I know that I'm going to, move away from my friends, and that in itself has a negative kind of thought process. But it's not the end. It's just a transition into some other weird and wild world that you go through.
Yeah.
And what makes this comic so interesting is its surrealist take, its slightly dystopian take. The way that it comments on the same pair of trousers that are on the sidewalk, and they don't know why it's there, but they walked past it a second time and it's still there. And it's that kind of arbitrary non-joke, non-humour that kind of builds the world around you. And I really like that.
Yeah, those kind of things have happened in my life. Like when I was a kid, you'd walk past something that was there and you would comment on it. And it's, as I said, it's not funny, it's just something that you see. And it is quite nice that in the comic you've got some background and a world building thing that happens that's not important at all.
Absolutely, yeah. That happens time and time again in this comic. Is they will just mention something passing through a character, like the Satanists, and you won't get anything else about them because ultimately it's irrelevant and it's largely conjured in their own minds. It's something they comment on and then move on.
Absolutely. I think being part of their own minds is really well put, because the Satanists neither have plot story, they don't have any questions, they don't even interact with them at the same time.
No.
They just simply wander past them again in the grocery store. And that brings itself their own in-jokes. And it's about these in-jokes between them. And it's entirely based on how they criticise and judge the outside world from inside their own little bubble. And it's this bubble which is shown in the comic.
Yeah.
I do feel that in the comic, the girls are a lot less harsh than in the film. And I like them more in the comic than I do in the film.
Yeah.
But we'll come on to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the girls themselves, they're a lot more enjoyable to read, and you kind of don't get more involved, but you can put yourself in their shoes at that age of your life.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think it helps that there's no additional plot line, as there is with the film, with Seymour, who takes up a large amount of that plot and really focuses it around Enid, whereas in the comic it is the series of vignettes featuring both of the characters, even though Enid is perhaps the more prevalent one, being the sort of stand-in for Daniel Clowes. But no, I agree with what James was saying, actually. It's extremely relatable. The whole comic is. I think we three of us are very lucky to have been friends for a long time, but we all had close friends at the age of 18, for instance, that we don't see or talk to anymore. That sort of quiet disintegration of a friendship, which is sort of occurring across the comic and the film, is something that's very we've all drifted apart from people. It's not life-changing, but it is something a little bit melancholy when you think back about it. And I think that's what is captured really well, is these little moments that everyone has actually experienced in some capacity, but never really dwelt on until you think about it.
I was going to say, at some point earlier in the episode, we might want to summarise the plot. I think we jumped in quite deep, quite quickly.
Oh, we don't.
Well, James, you've clearly not heard this before. We're all over the place. You can put that in now if you want.
Yeah, I'll do a snippet for earlier on. Snap. So the comic itself is based around two characters. You've got Enid and you've got Rebecca.
Yep.
And the way they kind of respond to one another is that Enid is the almost the unlikable punk aesthetic. She'll push people away and she'll judge them. Whereas Rebecca is the slightly more down-to-earth, quote-unquote, the hot one. But together, the two of them make a kind of interesting couple whereby all they do is throw judgment out to everyone around them, push themselves away, and hate the world. They're proper misanthropes. They really don't like people in that respect.
What a great word.
It's the tale of them through what is essentially a summer holiday away from school in the lead up to going off to university. And it's what they're thinking about their life in a town where nothing happens, in a world which is probably darker than necessary. Either that or their imagination makes it darker than what we're used to. They look at characters around them and they nickname them. They create backstories for them. So you've got characters who they believe are the Satanists. You've got characters who are trying to make snuff films, people like that. And it's a story about how these two characters perceive the world around them, leading to their inevitable journey off to start their lives proper.
Yeah, no, that pretty succinctly sums things up, because there's not really an overarching plot of the comic book until the final issue where it really starts to wrap things up, but there's common themes and tropes across all of it. So yes, I think that's about as accurate a summation as you can get. The film itself, however, deviates from the comic book, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's made for cinema audience, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, outside of the few vignettes or lines of dialogue, outside of the fact that you have those same two cynical teens mocking everyone and everything around them, the narrative is entirely different. But for me, it still remains thematically consistent. I think that's the input of Daniel Clowes in the writing. So it manages to be a faithful adaptation, tonally perhaps, if not narratively. The major difference in the plotline of the film from the comic book is that there is an additional character of Seymour, who is a sort of amalgamation of several characters from the comic, who acts as an interested party in Enid, or a character that Enid is interested in, and sort of focuses the plot around that as a cause of the rift in the friendship that we see in the comics as well. So there's that extra level which, just like you say, for a Hollywood, or maybe not Hollywood audience, but for a cinema audience, it contextualizes things within one overarching plot, which the comic doesn't really have.
When I was reading and watching this, I did come away thinking, this has got a very James feel to it. It's a very James film and a very James comic. It's so indie. And I thought, yeah, that's James.
It's not quite as indie as films like Napoleon Dynamite, but it very much is of that era of outsider characters.
Yeah.
One thing I'd say, actually, though, is although the comic and the film have relatively different plot line, I think that there is a film director who could have done justice to the comic in its comic form, and that would be Richard Linklater, who did, for example, Dazed and Confused, which I think is a very, very good film, pretty much focusing on a similar setting. But prior to that, he did a film called Slacker, and that's very much like Kevin Smith's Clerks, in that there's almost no point to the film. It is just vignettes of these two characters. And so I think that there could have been a film made from the comic book that encompasses all that the comic book gives and turned it into film. But it would have been a flop. It would have been an indie gem and no one would have watched it. But 20 years later, the DVD would be going for £50 or something.
In fairness, that is this film. This was not, I don't believe, a commercial success, but has become somewhat of a cult success.
Yeah. Do you think that might be down to the actresses, actually? Because they've gone on to do much more successful. Well, certainly Scarlett Johansson.
Scarlett Johansson definitely has. I think at the time it was...
Who?
Her?
I think at the time it was relatively... the appreciation of this film perhaps started earlier than that, before the Avengers and things like that. But it certainly captured that sort of indie sensibility Obviously, having Steve Buscemi in it helped. He was coming off the back of a lot of other indie films and also larger films that people liked already.
And Adam Sandler films, don't forget.
Well, this is it, yeah.
The Sandman. The Sandman would have brought Steve Buscemi to the public eye. Roles such as in... I can't remember.
You can't think of any Adam Sandler film?
Yeah, I don't think he was in all of them.
Pretty much.
Mr. Deeds. Mr. Deeds.
He was in Mr. Deeds, wasn't he? What was the one where... Was it Happy Gilmore? He was the sniper, wasn't he? No, not Happy Gilmore, the other one, where he goes back to school. Billy
Madison.
Billy Madison, thank you. Yeah, he was the sniper who he phoned up and apologised to. Anyway, let's get back to the... So, am I right in saying then that, James, you didn't enjoy the film as much as the comic book?
Oh, that would be absolutely true. I think that what happened is I read the comic book and I was so excited about it that anything would have been a disappointment. And I think that the film in isolation, because I had actually seen the film first a number of years ago, but in recent years I had read the comic, then watched the film. And I think that there was a downgrade between the comic and the film. I think that the film gave up some of its independent magic in order to become a bit more palatable. And I think that was actually a loss.
And Iain, you're coming into this cold, weren't you? You hadn't seen the film, you hadn't read the comic.
Correct.
So from that perspective, what were you expecting going in and how did it differ from what you ended up with?
Yeah, so when I knew that we were coming on to this, I hadn't heard of it before. It was one of those things that, well, I'd come across on like those sort of top 10 unknown films based on comics or that kind of stuff. So I watched the trailer of the film and like straight away you get the vibe of the angsty teen coming of age story, which isn't always my favourite. I don't really like watching a bunch of angsty teens coming of age because I'm now not that age. I'm 30 plus now. Like, I don't care about teenagers.
You're a grumpy old man then, yeah.
Yeah.
Just a grumpy old man, Iain.
Because I read half the comic, then annoyingly watched the film, and then read the other half of the comic. Kate had to watch it alongside me, so it was just time frames. But the story of the comic is very easy to jump into and just to pick up from you being chucked into it. The film, yeah, I mean, I have issues with the film, but something that I did find a little bit odd in the comic that then they changed for the film is that there's this sort of like, not a subplot, but sort of an underlining story of inappropriate children content in the comic, but they cut that for the film and they kind of replace it with views on being racist. I think that works, but I think the reason that they changed that is because of Enid and Seymour's relationship that eventually turns sexual. So I don't think you could have had those sort of children comments in the film when the story's changed a bit. So yeah, I've got my issues with the film.
I think that certain parts of that were actually taken from different stories by Clowes as part of his 8-ball. I'm not so sure about the racist part, but I know that, for example, there was the tampon in a cup art project actually came from a different comic of his. So I think that I certainly see where you're coming from. The idea of having an older versus younger relationship and then trying to also make an anti-exploitation of children message. There's a certain juxtaposition in that whereby they're contradicting one another.
Yeah, I mean, in the comic, she goes for Josh. In the film, she goes for Seymour.
Yeah.
And the same kind of thing happens, and the reasons why she goes there are the same. But, yeah, so the film for me, a little bit,
I think it's important to remember that she is 18. It's not like,
Yeah.
I don't think there's a necessarily that's the reason they changed it. I think they perhaps changed it because she had to have a reason to be kicked out of this art exhibit, and so they used this sort of racist old advertising because that is something that can and does exist.
Yeah.
So I think it makes a lot more sense than having the public discussion about deep-faked child pornography that you have in the comic book.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think the changes for the film work. I enjoyed the comic a lot. I enjoyed it more than the film, but I think the film works really well as well. I think if you hadn't have restructured things, I think if you had just tried to make a literal adaptation, it wouldn't have. I think it would have been a wholly unsatisfying experience. I think the difference with something like Clerks is the fact that it happens in a more confined time frame, whereas this is spread out over a summer and then it just sort of ends. If that had happened, I think it would have been a large disappointment. I think Terry Zwigoff said the original script for this, they did just plug this in to a script and tried to do that, and then basically realised very quickly that that wouldn't work. So they had to recontextualise it. And one of those things, for instance, being Seymour who's obviously added in, is an autobiographical character for the director. You know, being an obsessive record collecting director, in much the same way that Daniel Clowes based Enid Coleslaw around him at a certain age.
Coleslaw.
Well, it's Enid Coleslaw is of course an anagram of Daniel Clowes.
Wow.
So
there you go. That is not an Easter egg that I picked up on.
That's the egg.
That's the egg.
That's the egg hunt.
That's
Done.
the egg drop.
Smash.
So this is the idea, is that you actually have two artists with regards to the film, both writers and the writer and the director, leaving their mark on the script and leaving their mark on the film. And I think that in a way has its own artistic integrity if you separate it from the comic. Whether you enjoy one more than the other, I do think the film works in and of itself.
I think with Enid, she's very much like Adala or Dharma. There's that character that was in Beavis and Butthead.
Dahlia.
Daria?
I can't remember her name now.
I know the one you mean, yeah. She had her own cartoon.
That one. She's very much like that. It's that teenager that hates life but doesn't quite hate life and is being quirky because she's being quirky, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I feel that the comic is actually absurdly edgy. It's unnecessarily edgy. Some of certainly the dialogue or the mentality of Enid, you cannot write into a movie script.
No.
It's just too much. But in the short form comic, it's essentially to shock the reader in a short snippet. It's a punchline. Oftentimes she'll use profane language or a really extremist view of someone that's used as a punchline because of the short form of the comic. And it's almost like this character is a caricature. No one can have that level of hatred for everyone.
Yeah.
And in a way, it kind of harks back to like Holden Caulfield of Catcher in the Rye. The idea of everyone being a phony or an idiot. No one's good enough to be in my world. So I'm going to judge everyone around you. And I think that Enid almost has like a boiling pot mentality whereby she'll burst very quickly. She's got this boiling hatred and she'll just like throw it at people as much as she can. And within the comic, she's a complete extreme caricature that doesn't come across in the film. She's much more of a personable, relatable character in the film, which I think actually makes her more boring. It takes away from her character, which is otherwise a comic book caricature.
Well, I think she's quite unlikable in both, in a way, but I also think that there's something identifiable about that. But I think that volatile nature that you were talking about is very much a mask. You know, she presents herself as this self-assured and confident, looking down at the entire world with this sort of snide attitude of things. But it's always apparent in film and comic that this is a cynical pseudo-intellectual facade that she's using to mask the doubts, you know, her own self-doubts and her own insecurities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's possibly why, you know, she's still likable despite the fact that she says some horrible things. And in fact, actually, you notice that Rebecca Doppelmayr says a lot of these horrible things as well. And actually, in the film, it says them earlier on. And then one of the interesting things about the film is obviously the fact that she is changing, you know, her aesthetic changes as the film goes on. She becomes a sort of normalised, as it were, a lot more of a conventional dresser and less frequently says these outlandish edgelord things. And, you know, we all had that era of our life where we would make terribly crass jokes.
It's the shock humour. It's the jackass, isn't it, back in the day?
It's a reason Cards Against Humanity is such a big game. There is no joke to Cards Against Humanity. It is just the fact that, oh, look, it says dead baby. Isn't that funny? No, is the answer. And and that is this is this sort of edgelord shock humour that I think a lot of people have.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned the sort of humour in this, because something that I do like about the film is the comedy. So it's not just this dark comedy. There are bits of it that are daft. Like, there's Seymour's housemate that sort of farts randomly for no reason. In the video shop, there's the bit where you get a trailer in the background playing for a film. It's that classic voiceover of, in a world where there's nothing that's uncertain, like, and they've rephrased that sentence a few times in this trailer for humour, but it's in the background.
Yeah.
And then you get Enid's boss at the cinema, who's the classic 90s bully, who just picks on her for no reason. So these things aren't in the comic.
Oh, whoa. He does not pick on her for no reason.
Well, no, okay,
she
sorry.
is terrible at her job.
Right, no, yeah, that I get. But how he acts to her is like, these are the rules, this is what you do, you know, blah, blah, blah. So he's acting out as if he's a bully.
That's called having a job.
Well, yeah, but it's how he speaks to her.
I mean, he's a bit of a douche, but, you know, he's also not much older than she is. And he sort of says, right, well, you know, this is the job. And then she clearly does something that she's not meant to do. And she does it multiple times, insulting customers, insulting the film she's meant to be promoting. And the villain in that scene is definitely Enid. It is not him saying, "Oh,
Yeah, okay.
you know, I didn't watch that scene and think, oh, what a bully. He's being completely unreasonable." I thought Enid is deliberately sabotaging herself once again.
Yeah, no, I think it's the level of him being a douche. You see that trope in a lot of 90s films or shows of a bully.
Yeah.
That was what I was getting at. But yeah, the humour itself, it's not just this dark, these two are picking on people and that's it. Those bits, those examples aren't much in the comic. They're in the film. So I do kind of like that they try and make it a bit more humorous and not just purely dark and shocking humour.
Yeah, one of my favourite jokes in it is such a stupid joke about, oh my God, he just ordered a giant pint of milk. That's a vanilla milkshake.
Yeah.
But it's the leap to judgment. Any opportunity they will slam down with an attack.
Yeah.
I have a point to make about Enid's defensive exterior in that she's clearly troubled and is just masking it with this attitude. And it actually comes from the comic, which is the punk day, or whatever it was called. And Rebecca steps in and Enid, for some reason, has just turned punk. Dyed her hair green, which they use in the film, but it's a bit more extreme in the comic. And Rebecca asks, I haven't seen you have a punk day in ages. And Enid's response is, fuck you, bitch, this is what happens. And it freaks me out. As if to say, I have no control over this. This is just who I am. This is just who I'm going to be today. And then they spend their day bitching about other people. And then some asshole comes up. What's his name? Johnny Apeshit. So this is telling the kind of names that Daniel Clowes gives them. It really drags you out of your own reality and puts you in this fictional, over-the-top reality that they live in.
Yeah.
And Johnny Apeshit has gone into business and he makes fun of Enid for wearing punk. And Enid's defence is that clearly it's ironic. Clearly it's this old 1970s punk aesthetic that she's ironically wearing. She's not trying to be cool. It's so funny how fragile her ego is the moment someone criticises her.
That's it. It happens in the film as well, where she immediately goes home and dyes her hair back to black as well, which doesn't happen in the comic, just to punctuate it. But yeah, she's so obsessed with being cool, but does not want to let that on, being counter to cool, which is in itself her attempt at being cool. I want to try and wrap things up, so we'll move on to Ian's egg hunt in a bit, but just quickly, I want to know, what was your interpretation of the film's ending? So the last we see of Enid, she is getting on the bus, supposedly no service bus. So James, start with you. What was your interpretation of the film's ending?
Well, I like that it brought it back to this bus stop. Now, the bus stop is part of the story that is almost like a portal to a new place. And in the film, they use the old man who's clearly crazy or forgotten something, and they dump him there as if he's like a lost soul. And the bus stop doesn't work, and he's missing his old wife or something. And eventually the bus comes, and he goes away on it. So I think that Enid sees it as being this escape from her current reality into a new one. And I think it's a good metaphor for that. Now, in the comic, I don't believe she gets on the bus. I believe the bus stop is just there as some surrealist, potentially magical, unusual thing. Whereas in the film, hold on, I'm being fact-checked.
I was trying to quietly give James a little nod going, by the way, she does get on the bus.
She does get on the bus in the comic
There's
book.
one frame with her getting on the bus, but other than that, it's the bus stop.
Yeah.
So, there is one frame.
She does. It's perhaps ambiguous. You see her looking at the bus, and then you see the bus is gone, the bus stop is empty. So it is somewhat ambiguous, but I think the interpretation is that she gets on the bus as she is carrying a case.
Yeah, when she gets on the bus, it's her leaving, it's her breaking away from the life that she so hates, the world which she so doesn't want to be in, which she's made for herself. The irony is that she has a self-sabotaging mentality, so despite the fact that she doesn't like where she is, it's of her own creation. As arguably, she's going to go and self-sabotage her next life wherever she moves to. She goes off to university. She hates the fact that she's being forced to learn to drive. She hates the fact that she's got to take this test, when really it's other people looking out for her to see past her fragile and offensive exterior to try and do what's best for her. But she self-sabotages her way into a life that she so hates and pushes herself away from it. So the metaphorical, her getting on the bus to move on, in some sense is open-ended because there is no sequel. It's for the viewer or the reader to interpret. I don't believe that she's going to have a better life. I think she's going to continue being who she is, and she's going to find another Rebecca. And in the film, she's going to find another Seymour. Or in the comic, she's going to find another Josh. Someone to pinpoint her difficulties in forming proper relationships by just hitting out at anyone around her.
And Iain, what was your interpretation of the end?
I mean, how do I follow that? Well, no, in the film, so I didn't quite enjoy it, to be honest, because we talked about how the film has to have a structure to it. So it starts off as their graduation, and then it continues. And then you get introduced by this bus guy, and then when his bus finally turns up and then leaves, well, she says to Seema earlier on in the film that she wants to just leave and just, don't tell anyone and then just go. So as soon as this bus turns up, you kind of see it, or I kind of see it as like Chekhov's gun or Chekhov's bus, where you see him leaving, so she has no other choice in the film than to do it herself. But it did kind of leave me in a place of like, oh, well, that was just a plot device. The comic, because I've not finished the comic at this point as well, I think the way it happens in the comic is a lot more natural.
In the comic, there's a whole summary up to the ending where she goes and ticks off these last things that she wants to do, such as going to find the palm reader. There is a bit more of a goodbye.
I actually think that the comic book has a far more conventional ending in a way. The film, to me, is more abstract. The comic book, for instance, makes a point of saying, oh, looks like they've reinstated the bus stop, which in the film doesn't happen. The film, they talk about it throughout, about this bus stop that is out of service, the buses don't stop there, and then we see the man get onto the bus, which comes out of nowhere. And I think that abstractness is really interesting because it leaves it open to interpretation, which you don't get in the comic book. So there is one interpretation of the film, the ending of the film, which alludes to Enid committing suicide. That Norman, the elderly man who Enid refers to at one point in the film as her only constant in her life, he boards the bus, and only Enid is there to witness that event. And as such, it's perhaps a metaphor for his passing, whether of old age or whatever it is. And then Enid likewise decides to follow suit. And that is one interpretation of the ending. It's not one that I picked up on and one that I necessarily agree with. I personally see that ending as a lot more of an uplifting ending. I see it as a new start.
See, I quite like that.
Yeah?
The metaphor for the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the comic book makes a point of saying, oh, the bus is reinstated, and showing, I think more than one person comments on it. Whereas the film, it just shows Enid. She's the only one there to witness Norman getting on this bus. For me, I think the ending is more uplifting than that. I think because Daniel Clowes has sort of based Enid on a portion of his life, even if it's only sort of his id or his ego or whatever it is. Actually, part of the reason he didn't set it in any one particular town is because it's actually based on two places he lived. Daniel Clowes moved at one point from one major city to another. And I think that is perhaps what we're going to get with Enid. And that is what I see, is it is a new chapter and a new start to her. But I like the ambiguity of the film. Why does a bus show up at a bus stop that's been discontinued? There's no times for this. There's no service updates. No. She sees Norman getting on the bus. She packs a bag. She sits down at the bus stop and the bus arrives for her.
It's very... it reminds me a lot of the magical realism of Haruki Murakami, the Japanese author, if you've read any of his works. It's very similar to that in that something comes into existence, its only explanation is magic or absolute coincidence, really. But it's almost like mundane magic that you accept happens, and you get on with your life. But it's that kind of magical realism that the film has that I think the comic book only has in a dystopian way.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would say necessarily dystopian, but there certainly is throughout there's a sort of commentary on the changing of suburban USA, which I think was probably representative of what was happening. It's something we saw in Bruce Springsteen sang about it in My Hometown, something we saw in Blue Velvet and other Lynch films. But yeah, so it's something that has been commented on, all throughout the 80s and was very prevalent when 80s, 90s Daniel Clowes would have been writing this sort of thing. So yeah, it certainly is about that changing of suburban USA or USA in general from one thing to another, as much as it is about the changing of people from one thing to another. But if I haven't already ruined all of the eggs, I suppose we should probably get on to Iain's egg hunt. Is it happening this week, Iain? Do you have much in the way of eggs?
I mean, I don't even want my theme tune to play because it's just things that I've seen.
Too late. Stop there.
Ian's,
play the theme tune.
Iain's egg hunt. Iain's egg hunt.
Iain's egg hunt. Iain's egg hunt. Iain's egg hunt.
I'm not yoking you. Well, I recently found out that Enid Coleslaw is an anagram of Daniel Clowes.
Well, there you go.
How's that for a hot off the press Easter egg? No, I have nothing. All I've got here is things that I've seen. Again, isn't that just my egg hunt?
Yep.
Something that I do want to bring up, which I take every opportunity if it comes up in the source material, that Enid had an obsession with the reason why our podcast is called Become the Teapot.
Yep.
She had a Bruce Lee obsession, so I just wanted to pop that in there. There was a joke in this, kind of like a reference. They go into that sort of pawn shop. In the comic, there's a guy holding a film, and it says, The Hunt for Red October, but it doesn't say hunt, and you can use your imaginations of what that word could be. And also, Enid's dad is played by Phoebe's dad from Friends. There you go.
Oh, I'd say that Easter has come early.
But I'm hoping that James will save me.
I have one. It's not really an egg hunt. I thought it might have been an egg hunt, but it wasn't. That is, there's a number of songs listed in the comic book that are referred to by their lyrics with musical notation next to them.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this will be interesting, to bring to the podcast. I can bring an egg hunt. I'm going to spot one of these in the film, and none of them were in the film, and I was very frustrated. So instead, I've got in the 1950s diner where they first meet Weird Al. They're singing in the background. Who's bending down to give me a rainbow? Everyone knows it's windy. Now, I love a band called The Association from the 1950s, and this is a song called Windy by The Association. And although it's not in the film, it is in an opening credits in the television show Breaking Bad in one of the seasons. I can't remember, but that's all I got for you. I just love Breaking Bad, I love The Association, and I love Ghost World. But unfortunately, it wasn't used in the film at all, so it's not even an egg. It's just an arbitrary fact.
I mean, that's a terrific Breaking Bad Easter egg you've given us there.
You heard it first here, guys. Ghost World, Breaking Bad.
Right, let's pause the podcast. We'll all go watch 6 seasons of Breaking Bad and then come back, yeah?
Yeah. If there was a link, if it wasn't Phoebe's dad, but instead, I don't know, Hank. Hal's the Malcolm in the Middle character. Hank. If instead he was in it, there would be an excellent Easter egg.
It would be. I mean, we could make up some Easter eggs and say that they would be excellent if you want.
Here's one for you. I don't know if we said it earlier on, but she dyes her hair green. The comic's green. There you go.
That's true. For those listeners who haven't read the comic, the only colour used is green.
Also, Seymour's party, there's a lot of green in that party. In the wallpaper, the I can't even say that word. Anyone want to say that word for me?
Etc.
Aesthetics.
Aesthetic.
That one.
And David Cross turns up in that scene for some reason.
He does, yeah. That's his name.
David Cross.
Oh, me and Kate was like, we know that person. What's his name? It's like, I'm not going to search it. I can't be bothered.
Tobias Funke.
Tobias Funke, who looks a lot like James for listeners at home.
I am wearing denim cutoffs as well. Yeah, so that's an interesting one in that Daniel Clowes took the aesthetic of a black and white with only using green as the shadow highlight colour for the entire comic. And I believe, although this is completely assumed, I believe that it's because Enid dyes her hair green, so they just colour it green and then just use green for the rest of it. Now, I don't know if there's any other interesting comics that you've seen that use this sort of monochrome plus one colour aesthetic.
I have. Oh no,
I assume Sin City.
That's going to annoy me. No, because Sin City just uses
Is that not black, white and red?
Black, white and yellow, actually, is in the Yellow Bastard.
Yeah, it changes.
Oh, that's really annoying me. I read something very recently. It's another sort of indie comic that used a 3-colour aesthetic. It's probably down here in this pile nearby.
Just whilst he has a look for that, or tries to think, when I first picked up the comic, I skimmed through it and I saw this green colour and thought that would be so off-putting.
Yeah.
But you adjust so quickly to the sort of colour palette that you forget that it's green by like the second page or so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really effective, isn't it?
Mm.
It's even Scott Pilgrim was black and white to begin with, and it was off-putting then reading that in colour.
Yeah.
Colour is a real interesting.
I think it really works for Scott Pilgrim because it's such a vibrant comic, but I think it works because it's inspired by shonen manga. It works either way. I've actually found the comic. It was Moon Cop by Tom Gould, which is all set on the moon. It's about a policeman on the moon and how boring a job that would be because there's no crime on the moon.
That sounds great. That sounds like an excellent comic.
That does sound quite interesting.
It's all black, white, and blue is the 3-colour aesthetic for that. So,
do you recommend it?
Okay, so it's not as it's not off-putting. It's not bright and off-putting as the other one, Ghost World.
Perhaps, yeah, no, it's not that light green, that sort of mint green. No, I do recommend Tom Gould's. He also did a very good one called Goliath, which is I've got down there as well. But that's getting off subject again. So let's get back to the conclusion. We'll wrap things up. We always do this, James. We just like to wrap things up at the end of the show. So, in terms of the film and the comic, what are your thoughts? Did you like them?
Yeah, I did. I've got a couple of things. By the end of the book, I'm feeling a pure empathy with each of the characters, which I don't necessarily have with the film. I feel that the book has a really good way of creating real empathy for both of the characters, Enid and Rebecca, by the end. I think that there's a really powerful scene in the book that achieves this, which doesn't exist at all in the film. And that's when Enid and Rebecca have a fight over who Josh fancies. Josh is a character which is morphed into the Steve Buscemi character in the film, but Josh as a character in the comic is very different.
He's in the film.
Yeah.
In a sort of minor capacity.
So there's a scene, it's very simple. Rebecca goes to visit Josh at night. He opens the door and she just says, "Hey, what are you up to?" It insinuates that Rebecca and Josh are having a relationship behind Enid's back. Enid then becomes a victim character, as opposed to a bully. And it tugs at your heartstrings in a certain way that makes you feel empathy for the difficult relationship that Enid and Rebecca have together. And I don't feel that there's any empathy, really, with Enid and Rebecca, certainly Rebecca's character in the film. Rebecca almost plays a secondary character, whereas Enid plays a primary character. But I feel that she's normalised a lot more. I think that she's refined a bit more into a trope than into the emotionally ambiguous character that she is in the comic. So I find it harder to sympathise or empathise with her in the film, because I feel that she's a bit more of a straightforward, simply troubled person in the film.
See, it's interesting you said earlier about Rebecca and Josh there, because that wasn't my interpretation of that scene, that they had a pre-existing relationship. Because that scene obviously comes after Enid is making the rounds, saying her goodbyes, and has told Rebecca, "Oh, it's obvious Josh fancies you more, you should go to him."
Yeah.
And the next thing we see is her going to him. So my interpretation of that was not that they had been having an affair, but that one of Enid's last efforts was to give them a push towards each other before she left.
Yeah, I feel that in a way that scene my interpretation of that scene is that Enid then becomes the victim, Rebecca and Josh become more like a happily ever after ending. Theirs continues into a simple and satisfying ending in that direction.
Yeah, okay. So Iain, your thoughts on the film and the comic?
Yeah, so I was a little bit meh about the film. I feel the film has really good character building, but it comes across to me as quite slow. We watched it on Prime, and it's free on Prime, but with adverts. So occasionally you get a couple of adverts sort of like pop up in the middle of it. And so the first ad break happened about maybe half an hour in, and Kate was like, "No, I'm enjoying it so far. I like the character building." And I went, "It's a bit slow, isn't it?" And she went, "No, I enjoy it." So yeah, the film I think I'm a little bit meh about. I prefer the comic over the film, even though you are sort of chucked in. There's no main plot. It starts here, it ends here. It's a lot more enjoyable. And yes, you do get the character building, but a lot happens very quickly and you're sort of just chucked into their life. It's a much more enjoyable story to be a part of than, to me, the film. How about yourself?
Well, I was going to say, is that Kate's opinion of the film then?
Yeah, so Kate's opinion, she struggled a lot with this, because normally I'll turn to it again and she'll go, "Right, there you go, that's the opinion." This one, she was trying to word it in a certain way. Like, she enjoyed it. I know that she did. And she said that it's enjoyable to watch these characters, but it does feel like it doesn't go anywhere. She likes that sort of teen angst, high school drama, where I don't. There's like a joke between us that I would take the piss that she loves the teen drama. I know this is very much a teen drama, but it's different. It's not like, it's not the same as watching, I don't know, name a American teen drama, 90210. There you go.
Sure.
Sure, why not? It's not like watching that where it's high school and all this sort of stuff.
The OC.
The OC, yeah. It's indie, so it's different.
Riverdale. Shall we continue naming them, or?
Okay. Yeah, so I think she enjoyed the film more than I did. This is probably the first comic, and even just by reading the first issue, it's the first comic that I will give her, and I'll say, "Look, you need to read this. I think you'll enjoy this more than the film." But she enjoyed the film, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
But yeah, how about you?
See, for me, I think that although they're both very different, I enjoy the film and the comic. I feel that they do feel, to me, like separate works of art in and of themselves. Yep. I feel that the direction of the film and the writing of the film can be enjoyed separately and independently of the comic book. I think that there's as much artistic merit in the changes that are made for the film as there were for the comic book. I prefer the comic book, but I think perhaps maybe because I saw the film 20 years ago or so, and I've seen it before I read the comic book. This is the first time reading this. But, you know, I still have an enjoyment and appreciation of that film. I really like the fact that it doesn't really end anything in the same way I like films like Clerks. I think that your level of enjoyment, listeners, will vary depending on personal taste. I don't think this is going to be for everyone. As we've learned here, the film is obviously divisive, even though we all enjoyed the comic book. But I think that's okay. I like both a lot. I find them both very funny. I really do think that they are just generally enjoyable. Actually, fuck that. I'll cut that last bit. Both enjoyable.
So I'd like to say something about the film, which I think needs to be spliced in somewhere earlier on as like an introduction into the film.
No. No.
We don't mess with the order here. What you hear is what you get, minus Iain stuttering. So, ironically, I'm going to have to cut that now.
That's fine. You can keep that in. I don't care.
Carry on.
So in the adaptation from comic to film, they introduce a brand new character, which is played by Steve Buscemi, called Seymour. So Seymour forms this character, which is an amalgamation of a number of characters in the comics. So Enid and Rebecca, I think primarily Enid, like to terrorize victim characters as part of their own entertainment. Now, may that be their own way of providing value to themselves, you know, reinforcing how wonderful they are because they are not these freakish characters, these jokes. They are instead empowering themselves by victimizing other people. And so the character of Seymour, it plays the role of the bullied boy who is secretly their crush, which is Josh in the comics, as well as the whole scene where they ring up Seymour to prank him with a fake date. That's an entirely different character in the comics, but they build it into one character development.
Yeah, Bob Skeets?
No, it's not Bob Skeets. Bob Skeets is a different separate character they've also amalgamated into Steve Buscemi's character, Seymour. Sorry, carry on.
So as part of the adaptation, there's this Seymour character that you can always refer back to in the comics, but he doesn't play a role. And I think it was important that they made him because he leads the entire story in a way that there is no story. It is just a series of vignettes, of episodes, of chapters, which is what makes the comic so easily digestible. Whereas the film is one long, drawn-out story, which doesn't have a lot going on with it, but they try and plug in these various vignette elements into one continuous storyline. And I think that's what helps the film become well-rounded. But in your opinion, Iain, that it becomes long and drawn out, and that having these ad breaks through the middle only makes you realise how little has happened in the last 30 minutes of film.
It's not the optimum way of watching a film, I find, with ad breaks either.
To be fair, these ad breaks were only like 15 seconds. They weren't like 4 minutes of adverts.
No, but it's a pause, isn't it? It's like pressing pause on your...
So they were very quick, but it was a pause, yeah. Actually, something that I want to chuck in very, very quickly.
Okay, why not? Everyone is.
Pretty much all of last month, we was talking about how Ryan Reynolds played himself in the Deadpool films. Mm-hmm. And in this, to me, you've got Steve Buscemi playing himself.
I don't think he'd be very happy with you saying that.
I don't think he'd be happy with that. I think...
No, I just mean the comedy aspect of it and the weirdness of him. I think he always plays this sort of oddball character and this sort of weird character that I think this role suits him a lot, but I'm not taken out going, well, why have they chosen him for it? You know, or he's just playing himself.
The role does suit him. He's a character actor, so he doesn't disappear into his role in the same way as other actors, but he plays different roles. He sometimes plays the cool, confident one. He sometimes plays this sort of nerdy, nebbish character. So I'm not entirely... I don't think he's playing himself here. Like James says, I don't think he'd be very pleased with that comparison.
There is an interesting thing on the IMDb trivia page for this film, which is that Steve Buscemi found his costume that he was wearing and his character to be so gross, so disgusting, that he desperately wanted to change back into his normal clothes after a scene had finished, because it was so he felt so uncomfortable playing this extreme version of a depressed old man with nothing ahead of him. It felt really uncomfortable for him to play this character.
Okay, so the last thing to wrap this all up then, on the subject of Seymour, did you all watch the after credits scene?
No.
No.
So it wasn't Marvel who invented the comic book after credit scene. It was Ghost World.
What?
And there is an alternate ending
not
when
know that.
Seymour goes into the corner shop to confront Josh, and the guy attacks him with the nunchucks, where Seymour just beats up the guy with the nunchucks and steals them and runs away.
Recognise
Yes,
that now.
I saw that. That wasn't end credits for me. That was part of the film on Prime.
Probably because Prime have reorganised it so that because everyone turns off during the credits. Or they could sandwich in another advert.
Yeah, no, that did come up. And I thought it was quite funny. The redneck, stereotypical guy.
I don't know whether anyone has seen the film by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, Orgasmo.
No, James.
But Matt Stone's character is identical to that mullet-wearing, nunchuck-wielding maniac. That's a good film.
And on that note, let's wrap things up.
That, as you may have guessed, is all for Ghost World. Ending on a note about Orgasmo.
I've got
Have you got more points you want to add?
I've got not plugs of my own plugs, but I've got some points.
Oh, yeah, sorry, we usually ask. James, do you have anything to plug while you're here?
I have nothing to plug. I am but a silent man, much like our Bruce Wayne. I do recommend, though, a couple of things that this comic and film reminded me of. And one is an old film actually, called Harold and Maude, if you like the sort of young person to old person relationship, which is hilarious.
Oh yeah, is that Harold and Maude go to White Castle?
Yes, that one. Yeah, about the two young stoners. No, it's quite an old film about an old lady and a young man that meet each other at a cemetery because they go to random people's funerals. And it's about this kind of surrealist, odd pairing of friends. Another thing is I recommend Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused, if you like the teen coming-of-age drama. That's one of my favourites. Or the films of John Hughes.
Okay, good recommendations. Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for listening. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for all of our upcoming episodes. We're also available on Twitter at becometheteapot and just about every other form of social media, some of which we even remember to post on. Next episode, it's business as usual as we go back to the world of muscular men in outlandish outfits punching each other for our entertainment. To celebrate the upcoming release of The Batman, we're taking a look at the Caped Crusader's last on-screen solo effort in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises. For the comic, we'll be acquainting ourselves with Bane, the man who broke the bat, because before Batman can night rise, first he must night fall.
Ooh, that is great. Ghosts. The world of ghosts.
That was a spooky episode.